This is Jessie, and you're listening to the Curious Cabinet Podcast. Hey everyone, and welcome back. It's been a couple of weeks, and I took an extra week off just because this case that I'm covering is a lot. It's going to be multiple parts, which I really did like my first couple of podcasts. I did the Jack the Ripper case, which I'll eventually redo it because I'm not really happy with the way it turned out. It was the beginning. But this case is actually a case from my home state of New Jersey and New York. And a couple weeks ago, I did a short video on the murder of Alice Jean Eberhardt. And that's what kind of made me interested in the case of Richard Cottingham, who was known as the Times Square killer or the torso killer. And this case is just insane. Like, I just want to forewarn you that, like, the entire case is filled with just awful, awful things that this man did. So I do want to say that if you're sensitive to that kind of thing, this is not going to be, like, these couple of podcasts are not going to be for you, because I am going to go into detail about the things that he did. So, with that being said, let's begin. Now, Richard Cottingham was born on November 25th, 1946 in the Bronx, New York. His mother was a homemaker and his father worked for an insurance company. He had younger siblings and he pretty much lived like a normal childhood. He did move when he was 12 from to Rivervale in Bergen County, New Jersey. He had a little bit of trouble making friends when he moved, which, that's a normal thing if you move when you're 12. And he started going to St. Andrew's School in 7th grade, but he started to fit in more in high school. He had poor eyesight and he wasn't really great at sports, but in high school he did join the track team, which helped him gain some popularity and make some new friends. After high school, he went straight to work as a computer operator at the insurance company that his dad had worked at. He also started taking other computer classes, which helped him to get a job a couple years later at the Blue Cross Blue Shield in downtown New York City when he was 20 years old. And this was 1966, so it was big to be a computer operator then. Computers were these giant, big, crazy-looking machines, not these little laptops that we have today. And from what I could find in my research, someone in that position made about $100 to $120 a week then, which is about equivalent to $1,200 a week today. Now, in 1969, he was arrested for drunk driving and sentenced to a $50 fine and 10 days in jail. Now, this was the only thing that he had on his record when he was younger. On May 3rd, 1970, 23-year-old Richard Cottingham was married to Janet Cottingham. I didn't find her maiden name or anything, and I really couldn't find much of the detail about their marriage besides the fact that I believe they were married in New York. But they did have either 2 or 3 children together. Like I said, this information was a little bit conflicting. They seemed like they had a normal marriage, living relatively normal life in suburban New Jersey. Neighbors had described him as private but a doting father, saying that you'd always see him out with the kids, and he was the kind of dad who never missed trick-or-treating. Now, over time, the marriage had started to deteriorate. Somewhere between 1978 and 1979, Janet had filed for divorce on the grounds of extreme cruelty, mental cruelty, and abandonment. In the document, Janet claimed that Richard had 2 affairs during their marriage. He had refused to have any type of sexual contact with her since the late 1976. And he lived in a separate apartment in New York City because he worked late nights. And I'm not sure how early on he was working this shift, but when he was arrested, he worked the 3 to 11 shift. After his arrest in 1980, she initially had withdrew her divorce petition, then finalized it after his 1981 court conviction. Very little is known about Janet and their children. She successfully managed to stay out of the spotlight despite how high profile these cases became. But Richard was living a double life, and it is probably the most insane version of a double life you could ever be living. Not one person thought that he was capable of doing what he had been doing and for how long he had been doing it for, because he was committing murders for years. Now, on the morning of May 22nd, 1980, police had been called to a Quality Inn hotel in Hasbrouck Heights, New Jersey. This hotel had recently just had a gruesome murder only 18 days before. And the workers were on high alert, already feeling uncomfortable and nervous because of what had happened. Now that morning, workers heard a woman screaming, and you're working at a hotel, so I'm sure you hear some stuff. But the screams got louder and louder and began sounding extremely violent, as if the woman inside the room was being tortured. After the police had been called, the staff ran up to the door and demanded that whoever was inside come out. Richard gathered his stuff up, like all his instruments and what he was using to torture her, and tried to run, but they caught up with him shortly afterwards. Now, inside the room, they found 18-year-old Leslie Ann Odell, who had been working at a prostitute, and she was handcuffed to the bed. She told police that she had arrived in New York from Washington State about 4 days earlier on the bus. She somehow had gotten dragged into prostitution by the bus terminal pimps. I didn't even realize there was bus terminal pimps in New York. I guess you just hang out and, take girls or whatever. But anyway, Richard had picked her up while she was soliciting the corner of Lexington Avenue and 25th Street. So this is where I go into detail about the assault. I'll try to forewarn you when I do before each part, but right now this is where it starts. So Richard had beaten Leslie severely. She had been raped, sodomized, and forced at knife point to perform sexual acts on him. He also had whipped her with a leather belt, cut her, stabbed her, and almost bit through her nipples, leaving her a bloody mess. She explained that he talked to her and he had bought her drinks. He talked about his job, his home in the suburbs, and around 3 a.m., he told her that he'd take her to New Jersey so she could escape the pimps in New York. It was almost as if he was saving her, and obviously this is how he gained her trust. They drove across the George Washington Bridge, and he took her out to eat at an all-night steak dinner. She admitted that he was charming, generous, and sympathetic, and at some point, she ended up agreeing to have sex with him for $100. Around 5 a.m., they checked into the same Hasbrouck Heights Hotel Quality Inn. He initially pulled the car around the back, but then when she was in the room, he said he wanted to move the car to the front. So he left, and when he came back, he was carrying a bottle of whiskey and an attaché case. which is a suitcase. I don't really know what a difference between the suitcase and an attaché case is, if there is one, but whatever, that doesn't matter. Anyway, he started to give her a message. He started to give her a massage, and she laid her on her stomach. So I just want to, so you guys understand, like, visually. She was on her stomach, and he was, like, straddling her on her back, giving her a massage. How you would get a massage. But this position made it very easy for him to reach into his attaché case and pull out a knife and put it to her throat. He then handcuffed her, and she tried to convince him that he didn't have to do what he was doing, but I guess it made him mad, and that's when he nearly bit her nipples off. In court, she testified that he said, "You have to take it. The other girls did. You have to take it too. You're a whore and you have to be punished." They were in the room for hours together, like 4 hours, 4 excruciating hours. She said that he would take small breaks in between raping and torturing her to wipe her face down with a damp, cool washcloth, and then he'd start again. Like, it's so creepy. And it's like she must have at that point felt like everything was over, and then he'd just keep going, and it just, that's so awful. Now, it was hard for police to believe that this was the man who had done this. Like, he was a respectable family man, had a good computer job at a major healthcare firm, and it really seemed unlikely that it was him. But when they searched him and they searched his home, they found everything that they needed to know. Now, when he was arrested, in his briefcase, he had handcuffs, a leather gag, two slave collars. They called them those leather collars with the little silver rings in them, a replica pistol, and multiple bottles of pills. Then investigators started looking into his background and found out that he had been arrested 2 other times in the early 70s for associating himself with hookers. But both those cases had been dismissed. And, like, it's crazy because, I mean, it probably wouldn't have stopped him, but if he had been arrested and put in jail, things could have been much different because lives could have been saved, because he wouldn't have been in jail at that time to kill these people. But anyway, like, I just hear that in like cases with serial killers, that, like, there was times that they were arrested and they should have just been arrested, but they were let go. And then this happens. But okay, anyway. Investigators also found out that around the time his wife had filed for divorce, he had been known to frequent certain gay bars and some homosexual spas, that they called them. And actually, he started going to them so much that he became a regular. So, like, in my head, I think maybe he had an issue with women and he was secretly gay, but mentally he couldn't handle it. So that's why he did it. But he doesn't really ever say why he's done it, but that kind of seems like it might be something to go off of. But anyway, so at the home in Lodi, New Jersey, they found a locked room, either in his basement or it was like part of the basement he kept locked and off limits to the kids and his wife. Now, this room turned out to be a trophy room. His wife, Janet, had said one time he accidentally left it unlocked, and she looked inside and saw very cheap jewelry and a pair of women's underwear. But she didn't understand its significance at the time. So, I feel like I should not have to say this, but if your husband, or if your wife, or if your partner has a whole room, and I'm not talking about like a little box of old memories. That's one thing. Like I understand that, to have a box of old pictures or whatever from past relationships. It's memories. Anyway. But if they have a whole room that's locked and you are not allowed to go in it, like it's like completely locked up, there is probably something super shady about them, and it's time for you to go. Like, I just don't feel like I should have to say this. But I've never ever met anyone, like I've never dated anyone that had anything locked up. That's a little crazy to me. I don't know. Shouldn't have to say it. But anyway, like that should mean run. But after obtaining the arrest warrant, they went into the room and they found souvenirs of which he had taken from the victims, which had linked him to multiple murders and assaults. This discovery included a mixture of like bondage and torture gear as well. There was porn, there was personal items that I already said it. That could be linked back to the victim, sorry. Anyway, so they also found multiple sets of handcuffs, pornographic artwork, mostly featuring bondage stuff, books on bondage, and one of the big things, the motel keys from the locations of the kill sites. That's a huge one. Now, there was also a locked box, and inside that locked box was more of the items that belonged to the victims. Now, they found a small toy koala bear and a pair of earrings, which belonged to Valerie Street. They found the key to the exterior door of the apartment complex where Mary Ann Carr lived. He used it to return her car after he had murdered her and dumped the body. There was jewelry and other small items that were linked to, and I apologize if I pronounce this name wrong, but I think it's just Didi Goodarzi. And there's jewelry belonging to Jean Rayner. And all of these items were crucial because these were murders that were mostly recent, besides Mary Ann Carr's, which was, I think, about 3 years earlier. And where the murders did have some similarities between them, there was nothing that completely linked them, like any DNA or anything, until now. So this was huge. Now, Richard's initial trial took place in Bergen County Superior Court in New Jersey from June 6 to June 12, 1981. It had been presided over by Judge Paul R. Watt. I don't know how I'm not saying that right. Well, I'm going to say Whoa. And focused on the crimes until 1980, along with other non-fatal assaults that fit this pattern. Prosecutor Fred Schwanawade, I think I said that right, built his case on survivor testimony and forensic evidence. Of course, the trophy room. The court really went into depth into how he navigated as a serial killer. They pointed out that he had sadistic methodical plan to each crime. Abduction, drugging, torture, beating, biting, rape, and sometimes even dismembering his victims post-mortem, which earned him the title the Torso Killer. Now, Richard faced a ton of charges that were only related to Leslie Odell's case, including kidnapping, which transporting her across state lines and holding her hostage, attempted murder, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, possession of a weapon, possession of a controlled dangerous substance, which was, I think it was like a Valium or diazepam that he used to subdue his victims. They also had additional charges related to 3 other women besides Odell and the murder of Valerie Street in this court hearing. So here's some of the other victims. Karen Schilt was a 22-year-old pregnant waitress. Richard had abducted her on March 22nd, 1978, after leaving a Manhattan bar. He forced her to take the sleeping pills, drove her to New Jersey, sexually assaulted her, and left her semi-conscious in a sewer pipe near his former apartment complex in Little Ferry. She identified him in a lineup and testified about the drugging and assault. So then Susan Geiger was a 19-year-old sex worker. She was attacked on October 10th, 1978, after being solicited by Richard in Manhattan. Cottingham drugged her drinks, took her to the airport motel and in South Hackensack, where she awoke bloodied from torture. This included beatings with a hose, bites, and injuries to her face, breasts, and genitals. He also tore out her gold earrings. Susan identified him in a lineup and provided detailed testimony. Pamela Weisenfield, also a sex worker, was beaten and bitten on May 12, 1980, in Teaneck, New Jersey. This included an assault charge, but Cottingham was acquitted of this case due to insufficient evidence or identification issues. I'm not exactly sure why. But now you can kind of see the similarities. He had a whole system of how he did things. He targeted young women or girls who were usually sex workers, but not always. He'd abduct them, restrain them, beat them, assault them, torture them, usually kill them, or at least try to, and he often bit them on their breasts or nipples, and sometimes dismember them. On June 6, 1981, he took the stand in his own defense, saying that he had a childhood fascination with bondage. He claimed that his encounter with Leslie was consensual, but it had gone wrong, and denied knowing any of the other women. But he made a big mistake at one point. During this trial, he was also being tried for the murder of Valerie Ann Street. Valerie Ann Street was 19 years old. She came to New York City from Florida recently and was working in New York City in the red light district as a sex worker. She'd only been in the city for a couple of days before she met Richard. On the night of May 4th, 1980, Cottingham walked around Times Square looking for a sex worker. He picked up Valerie Street and drove her back across the Hudson River to Hasbrouck Heights Quality Inn Hotel. This is the same hotel that he brought Leslie to as well. And this was a place where he frequently would bring his victims. They checked into room 132 somewhere between 3 and 4 a.m. on the 5th, using an alias like Shelley Dudley or similar. He had a couple of different aliases. He usually posed as a respectable businessman most of the time, and then he lured his victims by promising money for sex. Once inside the hotel room, it turned violent quickly. He handcuffed her hands behind her back and gagged her with adhesive tape so her screams would be muffled. Valerie was subjected to hours of physical torture. Here's obviously where I go into detail about this. She had been beaten extensively across her body. There were bite marks on her breasts. Her breasts had been gnawed at so badly that one was almost bitten off, and she had been raped. An autopsy concluded that the cause of death was asphyxiation from strangulation from a cord or a similar item. There were 2 distinct ligature marks on her throat, and she had been choked repeatedly. There had also been traces of adhesive tape around her mouth, which Richard had removed before he left. When the maid was attempting to vacuum under the bed, it felt like something had been jammed under it. So she lifted up the mattress and found the body bound, showing a clear sign of a violent struggle. But this is where Richard made the huge mistake. He must have lost the key to the handcuffs because he left them on Valerie, which he never did. He also left one of the most crucial pieces of evidence behind on them. Police took a fingerprint from the inner ratchet of the cuff. At the time, they didn't have any leads, but it was similar to other assaults that happened in the area. But now they had a matching fingerprint when they arrested him. Although the entire time Richard maintained his innocence, on June 11th, 1981, the jury convicted him on 15 of 20 counts, including Valerie's murder. Leslie's, Susan's, and Karen's assault were also included. The judge sentenced him to 173 years to 197 years in prison, ensuring that there was no way he'd ever get out. He began serving his sentence in New Jersey State Prison in Trenton. Then, in 1982, Richard had a second trial. It was also held at the Bergen County Superior Court. Now, this specifically focused on the December 1977 murder of Mary Ann Carr, which remained unsolved for 3 years until his arrest in 1980, and they had connected the dots. So Mary Ann Carr was a 26-year-old X-ray technician. Some sources also call her like a nurse or a radiologist, but she was a newlywed living in the Ledgewood Terrace apartments in Little Ferry, New Jersey. In high school, she was active in Glee Club, Service Club, and flag twirling. She worked towards her career as an X-ray technician since high school. She knew that that's what she wanted to do as an adult. On December 15th, 1977, she came home from work, poured herself a glass of wine, and sorted through her mail. She was supposed to join her mother-in-law for dinner, but never showed up, which was strange, so they called the police and reported her missing. Richard had lived in that apartment complex from 1970 to 1975, so he was familiar with it. He had targeted her in the parking lot, forced her into her own car, and drove her about 3 miles into New Jersey and stopped at the Quality Inn Hasbrouck Heights Hotel. Again, the same hotel as before. You'll hear in the other cases, it's the place where he would commit most of his crimes. Again, this was another prolonged and violent attack. He handcuffed her wrists and ankles, which left visible bruising. He used adhesive tape to gag her mouth and muffle her screams, which he later removed, and the residue had been found around her mouth. He beat her severely across her body again, cut her with a knife, he bit her, and he raped her. Autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was strangulation. Some sources said that he used her own necklace to strangle her. And after killing her, he left her body in the parking lot of the Quality Inn Hotel, parked between a van and a chain-link fence. She was partially clothed in her white uniform, but her shoes and socks were missing. After the murder, Richard returned her car to her apartment complex and parked it in the parking lot, which initially confused investigators and led them to believe that her husband was involved. But he was out of town on business when she disappeared. On the morning of December 17th, her body was found in the parking lot under a dusting of light snow. Police determined that she had been murdered elsewhere and moved there. Now, the case remained unsolved for 3 years. There was no immediate suspect, no witnesses, and no leads. This murder highlighted the fact that he wasn't just killing prostitutes, but other women who were vulnerable as well. Because he targeted her in the parking lot, and he took her from there when she was leaving to go see her mother-in-law. But in February, a mistrial took place after Richard collapsed after being escorted back to his jail. It turned out he had some sort of ulcer. So the trial was delayed and then took place around late September. Now, this was a bench trial, which means there wasn't a jury, and the judge just decides the outcome. Richard was indicted for Mary Ann's murder after they found the key to the outside door of the Ledgewood Terrace apartment complex in his trophy room, which was obviously where she lived at the time of the murder. Testimony included some witness accounts, forensic evidence, and a profile of Richard's behavior that had already been established in the earlier trial. On October 4th, Richard tried to escape the courthouse during a break. His cuffs had been taken off briefly, so he pushed past guards and tried to make a run for it, but he was recaptured fairly quickly by authorities. Once again, Richard maintained his innocence, but on October 12th, the judge found Richard guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Mary Ann Carr. He was sentenced to 25 years to life with a minimum of 30 years without parole, to run consecutively with his earlier sentence of the 173 to 197 years. It was just another way to ensure he's never going to get out of prison. In March of 1983, he was transferred to Men's House of Detention in Manhattan, while he awaited his third trial for the murder of Dee Dee Goodarzi, an unidentified Jane Doe, and Jean Rayner, and that trial began on May 31st, 1984. And that is where I'm going to leave you guys for today. Next week, I'll get into the third trial, and we'll talk more about other murders that he had committed. And if you haven't already, subscribe to my channel. Don't forget to follow me on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. And leave a comment or anything or send me a message if you want to hear a specific case. And that's about it. All right, guys. Till next week.